Hi, everyone. My name is Bradley, and I'm an alcoholic. Yes, I am passionate about Alcoholics Anonymous because it's my oxygen. And I met Alan at, we both worked for the same retailer in town. And one hot Friday night, the first Friday in August 1980, I was invited to someone's apartment to look at their new B&O stereo, which was a really big deal. And there were perhaps a dozen or 18 men there, and it never occurred to me they were gay until the next night. So I've been sober since January the 23rd, 1987, and that's just over 35 years. And there's good news and bad news. I got sober in my 20s, so if you're really young today, this is what happens. This is what happens. You know, God putting me in my place one incident at a time, one day at a time, this is what happens. I'm going to try to, what I want to do tonight is I'm going to go through the steps and tell you a bit about how I interface with each step. And then I'm going to tell you what it was like. And then I'm going to finish with just some thoughts about having a length of time. And also, I just turned 65. The best part of that is being on Medicare. I went to the doctor and I got to walk out without paying a bill, and I thought they were going to chase me out in the parking lot for a while, you know? But that's really kind of wonderful. I see a few people in the room understand what that's about. So I was born in Massachusetts. My 4 grandparents were immigrants from Eastern Europe. They were illiterate. They did not speak English, and they were part of that wave that washed across the Atlantic at the beginning of the 20th century. And my paternal grandfather, we know his name, we know what boat he came on. He was alcoholic, and he died I think he was 42. He died leaving 6 or 7 children at least, and died of gangrene. He died before Alcoholics Anonymous was founded. My maternal grandfather, we don't know his real name. He knew that if he was coming to America, he had to assimilate. So when he arrived on Ellis Island, he took the name of a first-class passenger on the boat he was on, and he named all of his children after English royals. My 2 grandmothers, I had no luck finding out. We know their names. We don't know how they got here. They came as housekeepers. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who I really loved, her sister came first. She was 16. Her sister had come when she was 16. So about a year after she arrived, my great aunt arrived, my grandmother came. But how we settled in this little town in Massachusetts, my great aunt had received a job offer to be a housekeeper at a hotel in Vermont. So she landed in Ellis Island. She took the train up the Hudson, then across Massachusetts, and in a town called Westfield, she ran out of money, and they just put her off the train. And she saw a steeple. She went to the steeple. It was a Catholic church. They showed her the Virgin Mary, and she said she wasn't Catholic. So they fed her. They then opened the door, and they pointed across the railroad tracks, and they said, 3 steeples, and that's you. And that's where all the family came. My maternal grandfather at 14 went to Scranton, Pennsylvania, and he was a coal miner until he could get back to my grandmother. Relationships started really early in those days. They had children. As the case with so many of us that have immigrant grandparents, or perhaps immigrant parents, there may be some people here, there were some things that were really important to them. They had to prove they were worthy to be in this country. and it was really status was important, and their placement in their own community or their own church was really important. My parents got married young. They lived in the same neighborhood. My mother was pretty. My father was smart. I think my mother married my father because she figured out if she was ever going to get out of that neighborhood, she had to hitch her wagon to the smartest person she knew, and he was a smart man. They had 3 children. I was an afterthought, and I know now that my father resented me from my conception. I think I see a few other people in the room, I know that's their story too. And it made it more difficult when he figured out he had a gay son. My older brother was also gay. He died of AIDS in 1991. He was a cardiologist in Los Angeles, and my father blamed me for that. I have a sister who's much older. She had a completely different childhood than I had, and I've not, by her choice, had contact with her for over a decade now, and that's fine with me. All my basic needs were taken care of. There was food. The house looked great. That was really important. The house had to look great. Inside wasn't so great. I do know in hindsight, though, that any of the concerns my parents had about money, their children never knew. They never talked about what their struggles were trying to raise 3 kids. In the late 1960s, I was 12 or 13 years old, and my parents were at the point that they could start enjoying life. My father's business had taken off, and so they announced to me one day I was going to go to boarding school. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I went away to a boys' boarding school in September of 1971. There were 500 other young men there. And, I'd known I was gay since kindergarten. I knew I was attracted to other boys since kindergarten. And I was fine there. I was not sexual there, but it was a great place to be. The schoolmasters were really concerned about students, and so I sort of had I developed parental relationships with some of the older faculty that I didn't have as a kid. And it was also the 70s, so the 70s were pretty wild. Terry's shaking his head, yes, the 70s were wild. One of my favorite memories was I had an art teacher. Her name was Miss Brown, and she was African American with this 2-foot afro. And we'd go on field trips. She would drive a van to Boston, and she'd smoke pot the whole way, and we'd listen to music the speakers in the van were just vibrating. At any rate, I've always been a bit out of it. I didn't need alcohol to be out of it. I've always been out of it. The literature talks about a long-term escapist. I'd spend a lot of time in my bedroom looking at other people's houses down the street, these Victorian houses, wondering what went on there, thinking it had to be better than where I was living. And so I've just always been out of it. I graduated from boarding school. I spent a year in Boston as a legal gopher before fax machines, before we had one copier. It was the size of a Volkswagen bus. There was one fax machine in the law firm, and it took several minutes to fax a page. And then I, applied to college. I was admitted to the first class at Vassar College that took men. My parents didn't think that was a great idea, so I instead was sent to school in Switzerland for a year, and had a great time there, had a girlfriend there, although I still kind of thought a lot about, the men in lederhosen I'd see. And Went to Duke University after that, got into Duke. I have a degree in religion. I've always been interested in sort of other cultures and things other than the mainstream. And I worked in the dining halls, and I befriended all the African American workers. And so we would, like, they'd feed me catfish and fried chicken. I'd go to their houses, and it was a good experience. How did I get to Dallas, Texas? And I still wasn't really drinking then. I was drunk a few times when I lived in Switzerland, but I didn't drink because I didn't want to be like my parents. I didn't want to be like my father, who was a highly functional alcoholic. And so I go home for Christmas, 1979. My father says, "What are you going to do when you graduate?" You know, i.e., I'm not going to pay your bills anymore. And I said, "I don't know." He said, "Well, you better figure it out." So I went to the college placement office. They interviewed me. They said, "You need to talk to the head of the college placement." So she interviewed me, and after about 10 minutes, she said, "Bradley, I have a career for you. It's called retail. I'm going to call Neiman Marcus in Dallas, Texas, and they're going to hire you." And she called them. They came, they interviewed me, and they hired me. And that's how I got to Dallas, Texas, with a U-Haul behind a blue Audi Fox. And one hot August night after this party that I went to, I have to tell you, I also had this, before alcohol, I loved poppers. And I was at this party, and I'm with these people, and I really don't know they're gay, and I'm drinking Tab. They're drinking liquor, and I'm drinking Tab soda. And I needed ice, and Quinn Boardman, the host, who's gone now, he said, "There's ice in the freezer." And I opened the freezer, and there was a little bottle. And I said, "What is that?" And he goes, "They're poppers." And I said, "Are they like bitters?" Because my parents had bitters in the house. He goes, "Oh, no, girl. You inhale them." And he took a hit, and he gave me a hit. And I took the bottle, and I sat in the corner of the living room during the party, and I nearly finished the bottle. And I spent many years trying to chase that euphoria. I tell you that because in my story as a gay man, I've not done poppers since my last drink. And I just say this from the podium that if I were to do them again, I'd have to get a new sobriety date. Because for me, AA, a second meaning is absolute abstinence. But that's my program. So I kind of come out at the Village Station. It was before the AIDS crisis. It was the chicest place to be on a Saturday night in Dallas, Texas. The Texas Monthly had just published that June a story on the Village Station as the chicest bar in Dallas, Texas. And so, heterosexuals could only come in with gay people. And so there were all these, it was a bizarre time, and it was free love and free spirit. And I started drinking that night. Somebody said, "Do you want a drink?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, "What do you want?" And I said, "Well, I didn't know." And I thought, well, I'm from Massachusetts. I'll have a Cape Cod. And they gave me a Cape Cod, and that's all I remember. And, I went out to the bars every night. I was in my 20s. I was resilient. I'd stay out till midnight, 1, 2 in the morning, and I'd be up at 7 to shower and go to work and be there by 8:15. And that went on a long time. I acquired, during that time, a lovely condominium. I acquired a German sports car, and I acquired a handsome boyfriend who had spent 8 years at Harvard. He was a Harvard attorney, and he adored me. He was the older man in my life. I think he was 3 years older than I was. And by the time alcohol was done with me, all of that was gone. All of that was gone. With work, I've been a bit of a cat with 9 lives. When my drinking would interfere with my work, before I could get fired, I'd quit, and I'd get another great job immediately. And that went on and on. I ended up in Chicago. I had a great job in Chicago. I ended up moving to New York City, and I had a good job in 2 good jobs in New York with the same company, the same retailer. I co-managed a prestigious store in New York. It was their first store in New York. I still wear their clothing. Hint, 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 if you know where I shop. They fired me before I saw it coming. And I decided to get a degree in real estate, so I started doing that. And it was that part of my life. It was exciting to live in New York, to be in my 20s, but it was a very brown part of my life. It was all the same. And the pain the alcohol was causing me was very dull, because I knew it had really, by that point, had cost me my career. It had cost me friendships. It had cost me my primary relationship. I had put weight on. I really didn't care about anything other than drinking and doing drugs. But alcohol has always been my go-to. There was a blizzard in New York on the 21st of January, 1987, and it was a bad storm. EMS had stopped running, and my friend Russell B., who's sober now, we would go to clubs together. And the blizzard was going on. Ambulances had stopped running in New York City, but the subway was still chugging. So we made our way to the subway. We stopped in Central Park. We wanted to take a carriage ride in Central Park. We actually wanted to hire the carriage to drive us down Fifth Avenue to Greenwich Village, which they don't do even on a good day. It was at Grandiosity. And, we made snow angels in Central Park. And I think something happened at that point. We got to the village. It was a bar called the Five Oaks. We were with a woman. Her name is Jen. I remember Jen. And the Five Oaks is gone now, but you went down some stairs, and it was a piano bar from World War II. And there were some fabulous musicians there, interesting people there. The people you'd run into. One night late, this voice tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Can I buy you a drink?" And it was Harvey Firestein, who used to hang out there. And I don't know if he ever got sober. He never really had a problem when he was there. But it was a wild place. At any rate, I ended up there, and I went to some other places, and I ended up at the Christopher Street bookstore. I know some of you from New York understand that. They sold literature, but it wasn't the kind of literature you'd want to read in public. And I'm there, and at some point after midnight, I think someone's tapping me on the shoulder, and it's a woman. There were no women there. And she said to me clearly, "Your gig is up, you can't do this anymore. Your gig is up, you can't do this anymore." And it was the voice of Betty Ford. And we used to make fun of Betty Ford when we drank all the time. There was a period that someone in my little posse, we'd call Betty Ford, trying to get a quantity discount to come out there. At any rate, I said, okay. And I left. I went back to the Five Oaks. I had one more drink. I don't know what it was. I didn't finish it. My friend Russell, just to be obnoxious, said, "Oh, it was peanut butter schnapps." I hate peanut butter and I hate schnapps, but I don't know what it was. And I made my way home during the blizzard on the subway. I was wearing a full-length raccoon coat that almost went to the floor, and I had on an acrylic raccoon hat that had ear flaps, and I'd been crying for a few hours, and people going to work, at 6 a.m. in New York were pointing at me laughing. And I made it home. I went to bed. I was awakened a few hours later by my buzzer ringing I was on the 28th floor, from the doorman. Then my phone was ringing. There were landlines then. And then people were banging at my door. And above me, a water line had broken and it was flooding the building, but they actually found it behind my wall, sort of behind my wall and up a little bit. So men came in with saws and they just started sawing the walls of my bathroom out, which to me seemed completely normal. My floor was squishy, the hardwood was squishy, the parquet, and my doorman, Danny, who was Romanian, said, in Romania, it's good luck when you build your house on a spring. And, that was the morning, and the miracle is I didn't know I was going to get sober that day. And so my friend Patrick L., who I had worked with, he and his older boyfriend, they've been together over 35 years, maybe 40 years now. I just rang his doorbell in Chelsea, and I said, hey, how's your program? And he asked me up, and I spoke for just a few minutes. He said, do you have a problem with alcohol? And I said, no. And he asked me a second time, and I said, Patrick, I told you, I don't have a problem with alcohol, I have a problem with cocaine. And then he asked me a third time, and I started crying. And he said, would you like to go to a meeting with Alcoholics Anonymous? And that's where it started. My first meeting was the Red Door in the Village. It was a really bitter cold night. The room was a small room. It was packed. About a third of the people were housing challenged. They were homeless people, and they'd come in to stay warm and to get coffee and cookies. And Adrian, his boyfriend, now husband, said, girl, we've been working on you. And he moved someone's belongings, and the speaker spoke at a card table. He moved those belongings, and he put me right in front of the speaker. And the speaker, his name was John, and we had a lot in common. He was from North Carolina, where I went to school. He was a little prepster. He had little horn-rimmed glasses. He was in his 20s. He was adorable. And I was so out of it, I failed to notice he didn't have complete arms. His mother had taken thalidomide, which was a drug that gave you flippers. You see, sometimes see men in their 60s and 70s not with complete arms. That's why. It was a drug given, I think, for some, maybe, I'm not sure why it was given to people, but it caused that deformity. When they figured that out, they stopped administering it. And he shared his story. He was a bar drinker like I was. He was in New York getting a master's in oil painting from NYU. But I didn't notice he didn't have arms until he started talking about he'd have a drink at the bar and his hands would begin to tingle. So he's holding out these little hands, and I'm like looking, it's like, oh my God, he doesn't have arms. And then he said the second and third drink, they'd start to grow. And by the fifth or sixth drink, he'd have arms like everyone else and fingers like everyone else. And he said, but that wasn't the case. Alcohol deceived me. And when he said that was what I needed to hear. Alcohol had deceived me for such a long time. And it convinced me what was not true was true. My world by the end had been turned upside down. I was going to bed when the sun came up. I was getting up when the sun went down. People that were trying to help me, I thought were trying to hurt me, and the people in my life who were not helpful, who were a detriment to my well-being, I thought were my best friends. I had lost the ability to read and comprehend. I could read out loud, but none of it made sense. So I go to this meeting, and I walk in, and they give me a big book. This is it. You can see it's pretty rough. Early on, my sponsor would tell me things and I'd get mad at him, so I would chew on it. So yes, I've chewed this big book. The cover's fallen off. Interestingly, today, this is wonderful. This is really grand. This is an engraved party invitation from 1982. Henry Oliver, who's now gone, we had a cocktail party and we had the invitations made at the store. And it says by invitation only, because back then, if you didn't put that on, you'd have like 500 people show up at your house for a party. At any rate, Henry's gone now. And they gave me a big book, and I listened, and, the literature talks about salvation. And a second meaning of salvation in the King James Bible is to come home. And that night I came home. I was in that meeting. I'm like, this all makes sense now. All these problems in my life now make sense. I am an alcoholic. I still couldn't say it though. And I've had that experience one time before, and that was that hot Saturday in August 1980 when a neighbor took me to the village station. I walked in a gay bar and I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I'm a gay man. Let's get on with it. It was that just understanding that was in my DNA. So I listened to the meeting. I turned to the person next to me, who I don't know who they were, and I'm looking through the book, and I'm like, I said two things to them. I said, I'm turning 30 on Monday, and I'm going to read this weekend, and I'm going to take care of this problem before Monday, thinking I'm going to drink again on Monday. And then I looked at it a little more, and I thought it needed color graphics and pictures. And they said, well, you can do that. You can do both those things, but you're going to need to come back to the meeting tomorrow night. I'll meet you. It's in a different place. And the people who got me sober were just the people around me that first meeting. I was told some things at my first meeting. I was told if I had alcohol and drugs in the house to get rid of them. Somebody offered to come to the apartment, and I don't remember if they did or not, but I remember saying, if I had fucking drugs, I wouldn't be here. I'd run out of drugs. I don't think I had alcohol in the house. I may have. I don't remember. I was told to do 90 meetings in 90 days. I was told to be as honest as I could be with people. I was told to try to find someone to work with, a sponsor. I was told to say my prayers morning and night. And I said to Adrian, Patrick's boyfriend, I said, what do I say? And he said, well, you can borrow some of my prayers tonight. Before you go to bed, just say thank you. Just say thank you. And he said, when you get up in the morning, why don't you, and I think he wrote it down, and he said, you can borrow my prayer. And it is, for me every day, it is, please keep the first drug and drink out of my hand today. Thank you for keeping me sober yesterday. Please keep me sober today. That's my abbreviation. And I do other things in the morning, but that's what I usually say out loud when I open my eyes. My first year, people were kind to me. I was the crazy one. In New York, they stressed 90 meetings in 90 days. I went to maybe 240 meetings in 90 days because I had nowhere else to go. I was unemployed. I could introduce myself as alcoholic my third day, but I couldn't share. I couldn't share for a few months. I was the person in the back who wore black, and I also had a collection of vintage clothing, so I'd wear really bizarre things to meetings or be on the subway. People always complained in the subway that they were crowded. When I got on the subway, there were always seats around me. There were always seats around me. So that's sort of my first step. I didn't see it coming, but baby, when it came, I just accepted it. Doing that step, it wasn't an intellectual process. I know some people put it in their calendar. I'm going to get sober on this day. They write about it. It just hit me. And, I know now in hindsight, there were other times in my drinking career when that was a possibility, when people put something before me, but I didn't see it or I didn't pick it up. The second step came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. I didn't understand that, and after a few days, Adrian said, Bradley, you'll never come to a meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous and hear the following. I wanted to drink last night. I did not, and I really regret that today. He said, do you understand that? I said, yeah. He goes, good. You've been restored to sanity. The third step made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. I don't know how I did that. I know when that happened. When I had just over 3 months, people in the program said, you need to go to a doctor, you need to complete physical. And back then, there were no tests for HIV. There were no tests. There were no tests at all for HIV. And they sent me to a doctor, and the nurse asked me a bunch of questions. I told her why I was there. And I had these sores on my legs, and I was convinced it was HIV. And she looked at it and was like, oh, she said, let me get the doctor. And she brings the doctor, and he goes, Bradley, those are wine sores. And I said, I don't drink wine. He said, they're from liquor. They're from liquor. Your body is trying to heal itself. It's forcing all that out. And, they went away in time. But at that moment, whatever the doctor said to me, I was willing to accept that without reservation, whatever my fate was going to be. Fourth step, made a searching and fearless moral inventory. My first sponsor, people at the meeting pointed me, his name, I can say his name now because he's gone, Tim Douglas. He's a poet. And he's one of those people that he was a gay columnist in Palm Beach in the 70s. He moved to New York. He was the first gay columnist for The Native. And then he started writing poetry. And in death, he's become more famous than he was in life. People now study him. His poetry's read. It's an anthology of the early AIDS crisis. And one of his deals was, I wanted to do a perfect fourth step. And he said, I want you to get a box. And whenever you think of anything for your fourth step, you just put it on paper and put it in the box. Because he knew I would do it and I would edit it and then I would type it perfectly. And today, when I help people with their fourth step, it's all handwritten. There's something to me about that pen and not erasing. Whatever comes out, deal with it. And that's what I did. I couldn't do it at first, and he said, I want you just to list all your fears. And we went over pages of fears. Some were real, some were not, some were imagined, some were down the road. None of them have come to pass, though, in my life, which is interesting. When it came time to do the fifth step, AIDS hit him very hard. And it came on him very quickly. And he was undergoing some medical treatment, some alternative treatment. And I couldn't do this fourth step. And he said, just start praying for God to put you in a place you can do it. So I pray. And God put me in some place I could do it. The first week of January 1988, I worked out with my trainer. Yes, I used to have a trainer. And there was a blizzard. There was a storm in New York, and someone had come in the building, and they had stolen the light bulbs from the hallway. And I thought I knew where the stairs were, and I fell down a really large flight of marble stairs, and I snapped my ankle in 2 places. So I was in a cast, immobile for months. And it was before all this new technology they have now. And so I could do my fourth step, and I did it only, at 1 a.m. with 3 locks on my New York apartment doors, and I listened to the soundtrack of Morris. And it came time to do the fifth step, and my sponsor didn't show up. He didn't show up. And I didn't know what to do. That was part of my story, is being abandoned by men, the men and my father. And the phone rang about 2 hours after he was supposed to be there, and it was a nurse, and she said, we're calling from the doctor's office, and Tim had a rough session, and we just thought it best to let him sleep. He's sleeping. And he woke up, and they put him in a cab. So my fifth step started 3 hours after it was supposed to, and it went on until daybreak. And it gave me the vocabulary and the understanding I needed about what had harmed me in life, my resentments, and more importantly, what my part in it was. Today, when I do an inventory, it's always what the situation was, who it was, what it affected, and then the last part is what my part in it was. And sometimes that's the hardest. That's the hardest for me to see. And it's the most unpleasant to see that in so many situations, I had a direct hand in it. Sixth step, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. As the book says, after my fifth step, I was told just to spend an hour, and then if I was entirely ready, ask God to remove my shortcomings. And that's what I did. I kind of wish the first time I did it, I wish I had hit it a little harder, because the ego rebuilds itself, I think, every 7 years. So I'm going into the 6th rebuild of my ego. And, that's a challenge sometimes. What motivates me in the program now is I don't want to be one of those, old white guys who's bitter about everything and is like, I don't want to be that person. And so for me, it's that constant tempering down my ego and praying to be humble and praying to understand that there are a lot of ways to recover. There are a lot of ways for people to recover. And we all recover in different time frames. We all recover in different time frames. 8, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. I did that. I still have one amends to make. And, I don't know when that happens. I don't think, maybe the person that it happened when I was 19, before I drank. And, I've got it in here. I don't know if I ever find the person, if I see the person. I don't know how that all happens. I don't know if the person's alive. But I think about that from time to time. May direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. My late sponsor, Amelia Bowman, who passed away about a decade ago, it'll be a decade this spring, she said, I think you need to do another 4th step on your father. And I'm like, Amelia, I've done 4th steps on my father. I've been to therapy. I've been to the psychiatrist. I've prayed with the priest. I've meditated with the guru on the mountaintop about that man. And she said, she read me something, or she recited something, and she said, this is in the literature. I'm not sure where it is, but read the literature this weekend. So I found it. And it was about making amends to someone who had done far more to me than I had done to them. And what it says is, though in some cases we cannot make restitution at all, in some cases action ought to be deferred, we should nevertheless make an accurate and really exhaustive survey of our past life as it has affected other people. In many instances, we shall find that though the harm done others has not been great, the emotional harm we have done ourselves has. Very deep, sometimes quite forgotten, damaging emotional conflicts persist below the level of consciousness. At the time of these occurrences, they may actually have given our emotions violent twists, which have since discolored our personalities and altered our lives for the worse. And that was my relationship with my father. So I did this inventory. We did it. She heard my 5th step outside at the park. And I went into it thinking I was going to have pages of amends to make. And she said, you have one amends to make to that man. And I said, what about this? And she said, that you had no part in that. You had no part in those situations. This is the one thing you need to make amends for. And it was something really tiny I had done before I drank. And I said, why? And she said, because you've held it for 3 decades. And so she said, start praying for the willingness. And, I prayed and I spoke to him. After my mother passed away, I spoke to him every week. I visited him once a month in Massachusetts. And I just couldn't do it. And then one day that door opened and he said something and I made my amends. And there was silence. He didn't want to hear it. He had no interest in it. But I was free of that man. I said, I made my amends to him. I said I was wrong to do this. And that was the greatest freedom, that I was free of him. Sometimes, the problems I've had in my recovery, the pain I've had in my recovery, often it's things that happened to me a really long time ago. And the older you get, it's further in the history, Yeah. Continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. I hate to make amends to people, so I do my best now not to do things that I have to make amends. I had to make amends to a woman I did business with. I had to make amends to someone about a decade ago. I was on a jury, and they said something that was so ludicrous. I got into an argument with them, and the district attorney had to come down and say, yeah, it's a little glitch in Texas law. She's right. It's a really stupid glitch. They don't know how to fix it in Texas law. I try not to be late. I try to be on time. I try not to be in debt to other people. I try not to gossip. That's really hard. That's really hard. I do have a dog, so I tell him everything, and I dish everything to him. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only knowledge for his will for us, and the power to carry that out. I think it's God's will for me today that I don't drink. Other than that, I'm not so sure. I don't know. I know people do drink in Alcoholics Anonymous, and maybe that's God's will. Maybe that's what they need to do, or where they need to be to finally understand the destructiveness of alcoholism. I want to tell you, I think that when you walk in tandem with a higher power, whatever you call that entity, some things happen. I think there are coincidences that happen. And, Janice Darrow always used to say, the flimsy reed, what most people see as coincidences are the direct hand of God. And so I want to tell you about one sort of thing that healed me. It started almost 41 years ago. I was invited by someone I met out at JR's to a party the next day. And it was a divorce party for a woman named Sharon. And it was a big Dallas divorce. It was like a really big Texas, nasty, nasty divorce, everything that had gone on. And it was the most fabulous party I've ever been to, because you had to go with someone from the divorce, which was a whole nother story. At any rate, Sharon got on with her life after the divorce, and she was introduced to this guy, Gary, and she married him, and he was about 15 years older than she was. And he was just a good old boy. He owned a nursery out in Allen, out in the country. And I had moved to New York by then, so when they came to New York, we'd have dinner. And he was pleasant. He was, a born salesman. And when I moved back here in the summer of 1995, some people know I intervened in a gay bashing down the street with some other people. And the police would do nothing. We had written the license plate on our arms in pen. We had a description. The police were horrendous, and the police would do nothing. It involved 3 men who were dark-skinned, one of whom had just been given political asylum for being gay, living in a Mideastern country, and he was beaten. At any rate, a few weeks went on, and I was complaining to some people I knew, and they said, call this person at the Dallas Morning News. They'll be interested in this. This man interviewed me. He wrote a story, and it was on the front page of the Metro section of the paper, before the internet, when you got a real newspaper. And it had my name and I think it had my address. And I went to church. That was Sunday. I went to church, and I come home, and I had 3 messages. And one was to call Gary Williams. And so I call him, and I'm like, hey, Gary. And he's like, Bud, we read the paper. Our stomachs turned. Why didn't you call us that night? And I said, I wasn't hurt. I didn't want to bother you. And he asked me some questions, and he said, can I ask you a fatherly question? He had kids. Can I ask you a fatherly question? And that sort of caught my ear. I said, sure. He goes, when the F are you boys going to start carrying baseball bats in your cars to protect yourselves? He said, just some fatherly advice. And that resonated with me. And from that day on, we had a very different relationship. So I referred to him as my adopted father, and he referred to me as his adopted son. Well, Gary passed a week ago, Friday. He had a full life. He was soon to be 88. And the last 5 years of his life, he had dementia. It was happy dementia. But the last 5 months, he stopped calling me his adopted son. He had convinced himself I was his son. So, I dropped that phrase, adopted father, and I would call him Dad. And I spoke to him several times a week, and I'm like, hey, Dad, what's up? He goes, I'm good, son. And he'd tell me what he had for lunch. And it was just healing. It was just so healing in such a small little thing. And if I'd not been open to that, I think if I'd not been sober, I would not have gotten involved in intervening in a gay bashing. I would have been one of the other people at the bar who decided to keep drinking. But it really was very healing, and it was a little coincidence. It's like, oh, that's how God has healed my life. That's how God has healed my life. I've got just another minute. So what I know is, I know that in my recovery, so in Marfa, Texas, there's this museum. It's called Schnatty. It's an art installation. And it's where the U.S. kept German prisoners of war during World War II. They'd capture them, and they'd fly them to the U.S. to use them as a bargaining chip when the war ended. And so in this museum that was an Air Force base in German, someone has written on the wall with a thick paintbrush, and in German it basically says, God is present, bidden or not. God is present, asked or not. And that's what I've realized in my life, that God is present in my life. My higher power is present, whether or not I want him. Whether or not I want him, whether or not I've asked him to be there, and that's been the remarkable gift of this program. That's been the remarkable gift. I'm glad I'm here. Hope to see you all again in 35 years from now. Fingers crossed. I hope not. I hope not. Getting older is not for the weak of heart. I got to tell you, it's not for the weak of heart. If you want some advice, go to more meetings and save more money. That's it. Thank you.